Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mendicant orders. Our playlist is getting pretty large about this topic, and more specifically, today, however, an aspect that we never quite addressed, even in the general background, that is scholastic policy and politics. Essentially, the rise of the Mendicants to the highest levels of European education as teachers in all the greatest studia scattered across Europe, a policy promoted by the papacy to have a more direct control over Western Christendom in function, of course, of also of anti-heretical movements that, as we have already seen actually in a video about the Joachimites that we will refer to later, had not been devoid of problems, even within the same Mendicant orders. I think you know who these people are. I do not need to introduce them further, but the thing that gets, generally speaking, missed about the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and also other orders that emerged from them, that imitated them, etc., is the incredible success of the papacy in managing to curb fundamentally and basically defeat all the major heterodox and even more specifically heretical movements by integrating successfully the more cooperative, sort of more, of course, orthodoxy leaning currents of these movements that were the majority technically. At least they could be one also because of their, in most cases, quantitatively speaking, their relatively superficial theological beliefs, at least in as much as they were in fact against, and not even the church, not even the Church of Rome specifically, but again, carrying some broader instances of reform, of protest, that had, again, great implications. And the final instruction, uniformation, disciplining, and education of the same movements within the Catholic hierarchy. And what a better example than, in fact, the rise to the top of, in fact, the elite European education of the Franciscans and the Dominicans. From different backgrounds, because while the Dominicans notoriously had been born specializing a bit like, I don't know, today's professional debaters, writing great with lots of followers, they did essentially the same identical thing in the streets, in the squares of medieval Europe, where also the heretics gathered to preach, etc., and had developed, in fact, this, speaking of the Dominicans, this greater affinity towards the intellectual debate, and so theology, a much more informed and, in fact, scholastic, coming from school, from education, teaching, tendency that, in fact, was also the first one to kick in, as educationally speaking, within the church from these Mendicant movements. The thing was not the same for the Franciscans, that had been, instead, much more borderline in terms of orthodoxy slash heterodoxy, and that in fact would give problems with some fringes of, especially the Joachimite movement was a pretty large one. We're talking specifically the spirituals, the let's say some fringes we have. If you go into the heterodoxy and heresies playlist, you will find even certain further branches of this, like the Dulcinians, etc. We will keep talking about those because they're really interesting, because like everybody knows the Cathars, for example, but aside from often missing the actual ideological background and the actual theological beliefs of these people that were actually shocking, there is all a continuity also in the 13th and 14th century, in the peak of Roman Papal power, of these, of course, movements, because we're talking again times, pre-industrial times, in which coercive power by the side of governments and institutions was naturally much weaker, or at least we conceive it as such compared to our own, and that instead succeeded, right, at the time, in maintaining fundamentally a main, say, an orthodox consensus, even though, of course, being possible to avoid the existence of these other movements, some of which survive to this day, and also quite famous. Think about the Waldensians, who were, while persecuted by the papacy, still absolutely okay, giving green light for the extermination of the Albigensians in Occitania, which actually, again, I made also multiple videos about the Cathars, in which I get to pretty univocal conclusions just for what we know about this movement, that, let's say, if anything, it's difficult to, in fact, to draw on, like, not on a map, but let's say drawing the boundaries of the same within a specific reality. Let's say who was exactly a Cathar, right? What were their beliefs and how they could be identified? The easiest answer is political, right? What kind of movements were they, backing, or by whom were they backed, and for which reason? So today's video is not going to be about that, because as you have understood, it's a completely different topic. But just for saying that this history, okay, another video on the Mendicants, nobody complained, but I can see from I can see from the stats. So of course, Christian history videos for some reason do not get the same amount of views, but because there is really nothing that it doesn't make any sense, especially on a channel based on medieval history, and generally speaking, knowing what the broader relevance of moral forces and spirituality really are in history, to pretend to avoiding history of religion. It's just like, if you think that you can learn history without religion, just stop studying history immediately. Just you will save much more time instead than wasting it completely. It's agnostic heresy to pretend to separate the two things, by the way. All, not just because of Christianity, religion, whatever. It's just like a moral and scientific aberration, and you can't really study history like that. But I've seen also recently that actually these videos kind of get views. They attract, perhaps because I get, I've gotten a little better in highlighting these sort of more interesting aspects of the story. That video about the Joachites, for example, was very interesting because I got it myself from some sources I never read before, and I myself discovered, like, what it was 1 year ago. This, for example, the repression at the Studium of Paris because of the denounced, properly brought to the Pope by the same lay masters of Paris that had some issues with these, not just with the Joachimites or the specific heretical ideas, but the actual fact, of course, that that the same Papal authority had made him enter in the university. It's actually a pretty complex topic. We will see it now. I will not spoil it for later, but just for saying how many tensions, how much power struggles existed within these phenomena. All right. There is. Let's go by grades. Let's point out some aspects that can help to introduce this fact. First of all, scholastic politics, the scholastic policy, let's say better, you know what it is, right? During the 13th century, from the 12th, actually, there had been already a major debate over the integrability of the Aristotelian philosophy within the Roman one, and so Catholic theology. The, say, Western Christendom having based itself fundamentally on Plato, right? That was very close to mostly, but think about the philosophy of Augustine, the theology of Augustine, and so lots of other Neoplatonic authors that had favored, for example, the same development of Gothic architecture, etc. However, such an advanced civilization like the Western one during the 12th and 13th century required an increased scientific, theory that could be omnicomprehensive of in fact, the Catholic spectrum, and Aristotle was the most, relevant author historically as far as that was concerned. So through the translations available in libraries like the one of Toledo, from Jewish, from Arab, from Greek, the Westerns began to absorb, to subsume the Aristotelian philosophy, actually filtered mostly by the Persian contributions. We're talking, all what's, think about Avicenna, think about all how, in fact, philologically these works could be just at some point reconstructed. It's actually a very complex history. It's much less obvious than one could think overall, because literally at some point these people did not have the awareness even of which kind exactly of author they were translating. For example, it's only during the 15th century that Plotinus was discovered not to have been Plato. They thought they were the same thing, also because they were quite similar, but of course there is an important and relevant difference. Now, the problem with Aristotle is that it was not Aristotle, as Scholastic proves, but the fact that it was outside as a subject of what the church had up to that point been able to integrate in its own general in the theological interpretation of the universe. It was already quite complex. And given that Aristotle was really irresistible, given the level of development that, again, was very much needed, also in a more rational and methodological sense compared to the more sort of spiritual and, ideal Plato, during the 13th century, thanks to the work of Thomas Aquinas, but not only, and actually an enormous effort led by him, but some of the greatest minds in the West at the time, Aristotle was integrated finally in the Catholic Church, because the idea was that politically, if you were studying Aristotle up to that point, and so the ecclesiastical authorities could not quite check exactly what kind of parameter, the kind of standard to judge what was being taught and interpreted like through the work of the Hellenic philosopher, this studying him would have become a sort of anti-Catholic or sort of philoradical exercise, or this would have happened in the circles that would have been unchecked. And the worrying thing is that Aristotle had become extremely powerful within, as a subject of inquiry and study, in spite of prohibitions that had come in the most important theological school in the West, that was the studium of Paris. Now, to make the long story short, and it's sort of embarrassing that up to this point I haven't made a video about scholastics or Thomas Aquinas and the general development of the also of the Mendicant orders in the educational sphere. The greatest, in fact, system of rational scientific work in the history of Christendom was carried out. It's essentially the, in fact, so-called Aristotelian-Ptolemaic system that would remain until, in fact, the Enlightenment, and that was essentially like the banner of the ancien regime, and of course the lay and ecclesiastical hierarchical connubium throughout these centuries. That was, again, an immense boost to also the scientific capacities of the time. One major aspect of this story is also, in fact, the incredible scientific output that, for medieval standards, and this is not to say that was asphyctic or bad. Actually, this is what prompted even some of the greatest scientific technological developments theoretically, but also in technical application in the Middle Ages. For example, optics was greatly developed in this context in the major scientific studia of Europe by the Mendicants. We have seen just the other day with a video about the history of artillery, how Francis Bacon, that was living in fact at this time as a Franciscan from the Oxford Studium, could tell you with quite a an excited interest what were actually the doses for creating like gunpowder and or at least what could be applied to that military purpose. I also made a video on John Plano Carpini, that was a Franciscan who literally was able to be sent essentially as a spy internationally out there in China, in the Eurasian steppes, to come back and describing to the papacy, to the King of France, very accurately on the basis of all what we know archaeologically and historically, how the Mongol army actually worked, right? And these were people like that really when Franciscans made military strategic culture, right? They knew the world to this incredible extreme of science, technique, warfare, politics. In that video in which I made, I explained how the Westerners explained in this 13th century, for example, the success of the Mongol armies. Right, we made a great mention of these Mendicants. Think about William of Rubruck. Think about it's really plenty of them, and their intelligence strikes you, right? And the reason being that many of them started being from the institution of their orders quite quickly, after all, from conditions of even semi-literacy most of the time. I mean, especially the Franciscans that we were saying before, they were coming from some of the lowest strata of society, became the greatest scientists of their time. And this video is not about the history of science, strictly meant. I made something in the day, and these are actually very relevant topics because we tend to think, again, that, I don't know, nothing good was invented in the Middle Ages, or you really had to wait for the 18th century to have a scientific revolution, or whatever you want to call it, improperly. But these paths were incredibly important in the actual sedimentation, that same moral and scientific basis from which also the later centuries would develop knowledge further. They were points of reference, they were a moment of major regulation. You cannot really understand even the fideistic approach that of which surely many of these scholars also sinned of, Christianly speaking, if you don't understand, of course, the context of the struggle against the heresies, how the paparistic evangelical movements were won over by the church from where the same church had affirmed itself in the West as a true monarchy with an ecumenic ambition also in the control, in the regulation of the church, and of course the church meant as the one of the laymen as faithful. Only in the 12th century was a prodigious development. We've seen it in the videos about the Decretals, about the Edictum Gratiani, and there is really a lot that normally we don't hear about this development, and instead is pretty much the sap of and the backbone of most of the, in fact, not just the moral, the spiritual, let's say, but also the truly scientific development of the Middle Ages. And that's why this history is important and it must be told, because without this you can't really appreciate the deepest veins of the same Western civilization. White was, after all, very, very advanced at the time, right? The other part of the story is essentially, always blaming, thinking that the West developed because it got stuff from the East. The same, say, a recovery of Aristotle was not, let's say, done in the Arabs and the Greeks had it before, and so they were doing stuff that the Westerners didn't know about. No, right? They actually had a much worse, scientific level of development and thriving at that point. By the point the Westerners were actually already aware of the fact that those books, in fact, were laying in those libraries largely not really forgotten, but not really used the way the Westerners really needed. and it's a long story, but it's mostly boosted by this sort of strange obsession for technologism, progressism, and especially Orientalism, as it's often associated. Oh my God, they used to be so advanced, and the West had to learn. Not really, right? Not really, even before this time. But that's again a topic for another chapter, another video. And I'm not kidding about this, right? It's also like it derives from this, in fact, the sort of dark legend that scientism and modernism that have nothing to do with science and modernity, as a matter of fact, as this 13th century was quite scientific and quite modern in many ways. The same Gothic script was known as Littera Moderna, right? And it was the one piling up this immense, but I mean immense amount of manuscripts all over the cathedral libraries and schools of Europe to again something that in these was absolutely not happening, even comparatively by scale to this. So it's however you turn it, like lots of things come up that not only are against those prejudices, but they actually show you that the exact dynamic is true, right? And I think that Westerners should be today much less defensive and much more assertive, actually, in the affirmation of the superiority of Western civilization than they have been inexplicably habituated, like passing from pride to guilt, right? In a world, by the way, that is mostly characterized by shame instead, for evidently implicit admission of those cultures for some reason that is, I think, self-evident if you realize that the divide that will remain, right? There is not a gap that can be, let's say, a divide that can be gapped in a couple of generations. It's something that you have to go for in centuries at the shortest, right? And so it doesn't make sense to leave that position of prominence also from a moral point of view. But what I was saying is that the spread of the Mendicant order's education brought to the spread of the same universities, the studia, in Europe as well. The 13th century was the peak also of general development of of the great medieval civilization. So universities were spreading anyway. The papacy, the emperors, the kings were promoting these initiatives. Just the system was expanding dramatically, and so the need for regulation came as well. It would be interesting to talk also about how the early education of these mendicant orders had occurred, because it had been a quite immediate problem. Like a part of the friars had to essentially dedicate themselves necessarily to education of some sort, and so the Pope created some sort of programs to send these guys in the pre-existing universities to learn, but needing at that point, and so immediately soaking them in the highest scientific and theological education of the time, which was all with, as we've seen, that Catholic Orthodox project. And things began to just evolve autonomously to some degree, just as much as, as coherent as these communities were becoming, also administratively speaking. This brought to the theological tensions, especially for the Franciscans, the most rigoristic fringe of which said, no, we can't even have properties, we can't accept donations. Actually, the Franciscans were styled out, they were copied, right? They were modeled identically after the Dominicans, that had instead been like the good students, the good guys. Since the beginning, they had been quite, even much more pragmatic to some extent, about the organization of their own order. This resistance was particularly strong for, if you want, a deeper Christian reason that was at the root, in fact, even of some heterodox movements that were, however, heterodox in as much as they were bringing new problems that the orthodoxy had to cope with rather than being heretical, for example. The main resistance stemmed from the fact that, of course, the Gospels are, say, the New Testament as a whole is to be studied in a for the Franciscan, just in the Christomimesis itself, like their lifestyle of extreme poverty and deprivation was, in their view, of course, and also in the general Christian one, of course, the most obviously direct, like at least the most advisable, also the most difficult, the hardest, for coming closer to Christ's teaching. So the idea is, why should we study philosophy? Why should we study even theology? And the one that is now being so rationalistically articulated with Scholastics, it's of course rationalism was, say, there is always an excess of something in humanity, and so obviously in order to regulate the entire Western Church in theological matters, integrating Aristotle, etc., required quite pragmatic choices. Thomas Aquinas, we will have to make some videos about history of religions regarding this, because, of course, was, say, in the entire Aristotelian rationalistic building was criticized because it sort of was seen, at least, it's not necessarily that it did, as distracting from the most, say, spiritually and ideally loaded theories, such like they all coming from Platonism. In fact, that's the actual divine. Think about Bernard of Clairvaux, and again, the founders of the church, some of which would leave now. For example, we talk about the same Bonaventura would be made doctor of the church actually 200 years after his death, but still so because of the St. Thomas Aquinas, etc., because of this enormous work and this enormous and relentless, let's say, quest for the truth, right? Bonaventure himself was partly close to those more heterodox fringes. At least he knew the ideas and was defending separating the wheat from the chaff. What was good about that, it could provoke profitably and positively orthodoxy without turning into heresy, and so improving through the struggle the same theological understanding, and there is a general idea that the 13th century being the peak of the great Western civilization, so of universalism, of scholastics, and so on. And so this immense achievement was also the beginning a bit of the end. Like, you spend everything under, it's like classical Greece. I made a video about that in an Indo-European perspective, was what we celebrate the most about ancient Greece being in our, in the last couple of centuries, of course, the philosophy, let's say the art, all what came mostly in the more mature phase of Hellenic civilization, whereas what had actually sparked it was the much more primitive spiritual insight, right, of the Dorian migrations, of the principles that eventually did spark, like what you see in Hellenic philosophy, stemming from that, even in the more relativistic aspect. We're still children of that original primal way of seeing. In fact, it was very different from the one of other peoples that had already been indulging the sort of materialism, determinism, or relativism. And here it could be seen as the same, like that this great civilization had boomed, and so now it was softening up, and the crisis was next door, and so the system was not able really to save the entire, to save itself. But it's also true that it lasted for so long afterwards, and that, of course, the recovery of the West was still under the Aristotelian-Ptolemaic system, and so you can't quite blame that, even though, the liberal revolution sort of put an end to that indeed sclerotic handling of the same ideas, for how the people of those later eras had basically been using them, right? Not because they weren't actually good ideas, and especially had been generated for a very specific purpose, in which they succeeded at the end of the day in centuries like the 13th, right? So it's again, you can lose by becoming weaker, not just by someone being stronger than you, right? It's true at the same time. That person may become stronger than you, or maybe it's the masses, like in the 19th century, become stronger than the elite. there had been a time in which the elite had been stronger than the masses, and in that had been good. And the fact that the elite is sclerotized doesn't mean that the original ideas of the elite were negative. It's just that the elite was not up to it anymore, and so had literally allowed, because of its sclerotization, instead the fourth estate to just take over with all the disaster that followed from that. So, and still, in fact, what works today in the West, being not much a product of that phase, but something that, in fact, we can identify easily as the foundations of Western civilization from millennia. Right, and this aspect is often misunderstood. Right, there are people who self-sabotage the West just because, I don't know, because there is a narrow elite that sort of trying to hijack the media that shouts the loudest and makes you think that the West is about critical race or gender theory. It's not, right? Most Westerners do not actually give a damn about that. I think it's of course the garbage that it is. But one of the symptoms of the fact that the same people are garbage, and that if a civilization like that is, of course, is producing the stuff and letting them run, it does have some problems. Doesn't mean that you are good personally just because you post that. You may be as weak as those, and not understanding that by pretending to raise everything to the ground because you feel threatened, which is a you problem. If you're strong, you don't need to fear anything. Basically, just affirm yourself, you actualize yourself. But instead, yes, you indulge into this ever more defensivistic, sabotaging aspect. You are supporting sewer countries and sewer people against your own in a way that is utterly disgusting. But that's a same mirror of your own cultural inferiority as much as the one who produce gender theory, this kind of transing the kids, religion or whatever. Because again, it's an illusion, right? Reality is actually not about that. It's not about conspiracy theories. It's not about all what, in fact, lesser people indulge into because they cannot afford to control the world themselves. And if you look at the 13th century, definitely you had with means that today you wouldn't be able to recover, even if you tried for millennia yourself, able to achieve this, right? To achieve this through reason, but also wisdom. And so that's actually the coupling of Aristotle and Plato, and that after all, any civilization must be archetypically about. The Franciscans were, for this reason, the most problematic group, because they were more like the populistic ones, if you want. They were the ones who were closer to the poor, for the good reasons, for helping, for having this more ascetical, in fact also very not just asceticistic but also mystical approach, which was not actually that far away, in fact, from the Platonistic one, but that one not coupled with reason, with shipwreck. And that's where you have, in fact, heresies within the same system, and things that basically it's always the same populistic, lesser people's mental illness that is always, again, there is a major conspiracy theory. We hate the authority because we cannot afford to be the authority, right? Because we have lost our divine capacity, our divine spark of self-actualization. We don't even try anymore. In fact, this is what everybody was criticizing them, even from within the Franciscan order. Like, for example, those who wanted to build the Franciscan order in terms of, houses of property or whatever that were in theory against, Christ's just poor itinerance. It was not even just about that extremistic poverty in the way they would have liked it, in fact, to be. We're saying, look, we have to make things work, and things in this fallen world work like this. And if you want to achieve something great, you have to restart from your own sin itself. And so, yes, an ascetical experience is great, but it must be also substantiated for coming back to the world and doing something about that. I made a video about this specifically, the one about Peter Damian. We're 2 centuries before this, in the moment of probably the foundation of the Gregorian Church, of the Papal monarchy, and highlighting there, even again in this more originary time, how in fact only 200 years, like the world, like from creation, had degenerated further into this problem that of still keeping together these movements rather than having, like in the 11th, a much more concrete idea of the necessity of the hierarchy of the order. In fact, those same movements like the Patari, etc., were much more respectful towards the ecclesiastical authority, even though they were basically the same popularistic evangelical movements. And like things had been softening up and unregulated, a bit like whenever a great civilization expands, right? You cannot check everybody. It's just like today. In fact, the appalling conditions of moral and scientific culture of the average person. Because, yes, it's true, before people were less educated on average, but they were also more framed under a hierarchy that was effectively educated, right? Today, everybody's a bit educated, and so if you multiply it for the mass, that seems an enormous much as it is, really, but it's not that in qualitative terms necessarily it has been producing more. From the 1970s, things have started to go down, but severely so. We know that. IQs are plummeting. We can't see in front of our eyes, like the complete emotional reversal from, again, pride to guilt, and the unavoidable passage from strength to weakness. That is also a relative thing within our own high standards. Like, it's not that other peoples are doing anything better. Actually, they actually always have it worse, because they already start from a worse position. But let's say the age of time, the perishing has of course struck them at a metaphysical level already, and it's not that these are more backward equals more traditional, absolutely not. Right? You can have traditionalist or cultures that are completely garbage, weak, inferior, underdeveloped, and because form is not substance, and vice versa. All right, and this was very clear just by studying Aristotle, for that matter. The Franciscans creating more problems, at least within those currents that were more resistant to this actually enforced education. I like this idea as well that, of course, we have understood as a civilization that if you not use coercion, you can't quite accept much. This, in a world of angels, we wouldn't need that, but actually also angels are not gods, so they would need that in that situation as well. But given that there is no worse stupid than he who does not want to understand, of course, you have to use violence at that point. It's not a matter of success granted for that matter. It's been proven that you can bomb the hell out of a people and still it remains just a garbage people in the first place. And so you have to make a much greater work to improve things. The point being that, of course, the same for which if you don't send your children to school today, you go to jail, right? And that's perfectly cool, right? Except it would be the conservative who says, no, because now in my schools they teach gender theory. Yeah, they do, because you have been forgetting about education yourself. You're a freaking citizen. You must have the power and authority to impose what is taught in schools. Right? Schools are not there to indoctrinate children against your will. It's the people who cover the office who do. Right? The school must be preserved because it's a sacred institution, just as much as the church and the hierarchy of power. Right? And if you again live in a degenerated society, you are part of it, and you are equally responsible. So if you don't do anything and you just shut down paranoidly and refuse the imperium and involve into your own weakness, you will be the next one to be searched for house to house and taken down by a dictatorship, because that's how it ends, right? So stop whining about your own inferiority and trying to make an alibi for that. Just show some balls, right? Because that's the only thing that actually matters in this world. Otherwise, you will be erased. That's how simple it is. That's what tradition, with capital T, teaches from millennia. The Franciscan order, however, is also complying after all, and in fact, that's why it's a pride of Western civilization, just like the Dominican. Up to this day, the Franciscans are successfully clericalized, right? And this brought to an end of the aforementioned resistance. Not after some trouble. They were surpassed, right, by the mid-13th century. And again, I made a video about the scandal of the University of Paris. Also, to make the long story short, theologically about this, many, say, of the, within the Franciscan order, many members were followers of Joachim da Fiore's work, right? This was a Calabrese friar who had worked relentlessly he lived generation before. In his life, he had been a great biblical exegesis. He had also prophetized a lot about the end time and so on. And so, of course, people were very sensible about these things. He wrote objectively very interesting things. We have to talk about him at some point. And yet, there was something about this guy that was a bit heterodox in itself. There was a subtle criticism to, let's say, the power, like the temporal one. So it was in this fit pretty well with that sort of populistic attack of the church, or at least the church hierarchies. And so this had degenerated among the Joachimites, this after the death of Joachim, within the St. Franciscan order, into the idea that based on the different ages that the Calabrese friar had essentially prophesied, the gospel would have not been eternal, right? Because there would have been an age of the spirit, an age of the ghost, in which the second come of Christ would have sort of cancelled the gospel, and so just his rule would have been it, right? It would have not been the need for this human in the age of the Son, which is the one in which we would have been living still, because of course the prophecy was also properly pinpointing some dates. The Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, for example, was seen as the Antichrist. At his death, there were authors like Salim Bene of Parma who declared, like, I believed in Joachim and I believed that Frederick was the Antichrist. They would have had to come to rule over the earth, but falling because of Christ would have come. But he died. Christ has not come yet again. And, you know, even Hitler was wrong, which was also great. He was a Franciscan, by the way. So they really cared. Salim Bene is famous because he's the author of one of the most important chronicles of his times. And we talked about him in the video about Parma, by the way. And to make long story short, however, the main issue with these fringes of Joachimism, especially the spirituals that were connected a bit with this movement, it's not entirely clear, because as we will see now, the church made also a damnatio memoriae of all these movements, but was the denial of the eternity of the gospel. And since at this point there were lots of Franciscans holding these views already integrated in the studium of Paris, the lay doctors that taught there and that were already intolerant of these Franciscans, who were a completely different thing, where, again, these people were laymen, and the Mendicant orders had come again to overwhelm, even numerically, these things, and through the will of the Pope and the King of France joined to control better the studium of Paris, that had been in fact this cradle of great thinkers, but that had also wanted to be more autonomous. These were the guys who had been studying Aristotle, falling to specific heresies themselves, because they were unchecked, uncontrolled. In a way or another, however, by this time they realized they could not oust the Mendicants, but they went to the Pope and said, look, these guys are believing that there are booklets circulating about this and that on the gospel and more. I'm making it very simple. And this was a huge scandal, because, again, it was happening in the studium of Paris, but even more of that, this was happening after the enormous, again, scholastic policy carried out by the papacy and other lay authorities in stressing the fact that now there was a sort of gold standard for knowledge, for science, for morality. And the very people that represented essentially the redemption from heterodoxy that the Pope had integrated as paparistic evangelical movements, making them live in those ways, but in full orthodoxy. And this was the most important thing. We're now revealing still to have open heresies and teaching, being prominent in even the most important faculty of theology in the West. So it was actually a massive repression, which brought, by the way, to the destruction of all these booklets that were burned. The previous general of the Franciscan order that was close to these ideas, but not fully buying them, of course, but being also a quite respected individual, was obliged to resign, and so he did, and this whole story was essentially cancelled in memory because nothing had to stain the good name of the Franciscans. That objectively had been a great success of Catholicism and would remain so, because these heresies would not leave if not in some very marginalized groups that were not technically part of the order. Again, there were wars of crusades, there were, people repressed in northern Italy, in the pre-Alpine valleys. They literally had to send the lay, of course, arm of the law, right? Killing, because the church could not do that otherwise. But these were now seceded properly. They, after this repression, was already a general, like those who wanted to remain and accepting the order that the church had given to the Franciscans, either again accepted this or they sort of abandoned the order, maybe remaining close but still saying, no, we want to follow Francis' rule just the way we think it is. Of course, Francis himself back in the day had to cope with these issues because the Pope at some point asked him to revise the rule, and he was quite, he was a quite strongly minded individual, and he would have not liked to change that, but he did because he felt compelled by this responsibility that came, realizing that his movement was enormous, that in his lifetime, there were huge groups of Franciscans in countries that he had never even visited, right, and that were now entering also in this educational needs. So something insane, like the success of St. Francis. I made a video about him, but we must come back on his life, on his rule, because it's on his works, by the way, because it's, of course, just a giant in history of mankind. You can't quite understand, in fact, how much burden was on his shoulders and how much relevant, in fact, as these events after his death would prove, for him to be extremely careful about every single aspect of his rule, right, not to fall out of orthodoxy. And of course, Francis was not, differently from some of his followers, wanting to fall out of that, right? It's also complex to see. I like the analogy of social media today. Followers, those who start movements, will go out there, etc., because it's sort of very similar to that. And you would expect, again, that the usual story that in the Middle Ages people did not communicate or had difficulties to do so, and people did not travel. Study Francis' life and realize how many followers he had all over Europe without even having met the overwhelming majority of them, and how the Franciscans still exist today as a consequence, and the fact he was considered a saint already at the time. It's not that this happened with anybody else, right? So you must understand why, and it's not just some random strange thing. It all comes from the context and the problems of those times. Now, after I think I have to check this, but because eventually the general of the Franciscan order was Bonaventura da Bagnoregio, right, father of the church, saint, yet another incredible figure in the realm of theology. He followed, I think it was Gregory of Parma, if I not remember the name exactly, the guy who had to resign. I remembered this, but now I don't want to search for it. Bonaventura was the guy who had to quell all issues, who had to be accepted by everyone, and it was actually a very difficult task. He was actually close to the same heterodox ideas, paradoxically, but not in the sense that he supported them, but he could, as we were saying before, separate the wheat from the chaff in them. And so explaining how, like, even defending the movement that, of course, like the Franciscans, in spite of the papal intervention, now were accused again by the masters of Paris, saying you are the ones who wanted to be all candid and pure, etc. He brought heresy, and Bonaventura was actually explaining what was good about their work. He supported enormously the pauperistic model of St. Francis as Christomimesis when the masters criticized, even alongside some Franciscans, that of course there was a need for property, a need for housing, for a broader administration, for donations. And generally speaking, the order was going towards that direction. But Bonaventura had, remember, to defend the name, the good name, also of those who wanted to carry out a more Christ-like and Francis-like lifestyle, and that were okay, right? The Pope had integrated these movements exactly because that was fine, as long as things did not shipwreck theologically. Right, there was nothing wrong in living like that. There was nothing wrong with having a more rigoristic current within the Franciscan order that could show the world, the faithful, that of course it was possible to live as Saint Francis. It was possible to, well, Bonaventure himself, of course, stressed that Christ can never be reached, but that in this sense, Francis was essentially coming pretty close with his stigmata and everything, but not only. It was about the poverty, but it was about this, again, ascetic, almost, again, torture, like self-torture, in order to come close to Christ's suffering, and in order to understand, that, to come closer to the truth, the meaning of life, its value, its worth, right? It's also visiting the places of, the monasteries, the hermitages, and so on. This is a very important part of knowing Europe, for example, realizing what it meant at the time to make this life choice, why that would occur, why would so many people want to live like that, and what this meant for society. What was this a reaction to, right? And as you understand, it's not dichotomic. This is not a classistic, populistic, communistic, collectivistic thing. It is literally about responsibility. It's something that, as we were remembering before, with Peter Damien, the most responsible can do. That was a guy who literally lived in some conditions of enormous deprivations as a hermit, but then afterward would literally, during his entire lifetime, would go out there as a major judge, as a bishop, as a major international figure, dealing with emperors, with popes, solving practical legal matters in the cities, with his aura of spirituality that was cultivated, again, ascetically, in this moment of deprivation. This is part of tradition as well. You need essentially an initiation, a moment in which you suffer, a moment in which you have to struggle, you have to work hard, and knowing how to cultivate this over time, but eventually giving this back to the world in the form of imperium and of actual accomplishment. So this was the main tension, because this depends also on the people. There are people who just want to live closer to the poor. They want to just support the people who hate them, right? I'm definitely not one of these people just by temper, but it's not necessarily a positive thing either to say that, okay, look, who does this is doing negative. Society does need these people as well, right? We all need to be in part that, right? And we all need to be also out there doing something bigger, greater, more ambitious, more also apparently self-serving, but actually meant to improve ourselves to be more useful for the others. So again, each person has in fact a personal customized experience, but you must take into account what's the actual role of the people who want to live like this as well. Bonaventura is also a very interesting figure in general. He was originally of, in fact, Bagnoregio. That is a town it's very famous. It's often pops up in the Italian tour, touristic, imagery. Like it's a hilltop, right, a very steep one, surrounded by on some cliffs, right, connected with a bridge. It was an ancient Etruscan citadel. It's in Roman Tuscia, right? And this guy, we know a few about him. We know that he didn't know Francis in his lifetime, but he was, of course, an enormous, lover, follower, however you want to take that into account. And in fact, he's also extremely famous for his generalate of the Franciscan order, as he had, first of all, to cope with this enormous crisis followed to the scandal of Paris, but also he was one of the most important, he was a historian of Francis' life. He gave us the best, let's say, history in a theologically critical form, so to also politically address like the issues that had emerged, like what did Francis actually say, right? Aside from his life, from his rule that could be read, but his life historically, what does that tell to us, right? How did he live? And so Bonaventura had to be quite careful about writing this. He made a masterpiece. He also influenced for example, the first artistic representation of Francis, the theological meaning and symbolism was all very carefully studied to address certain issues, again, that had emerged after, not just after Francis' death, but also during his own life. And he traveled a lot, mostly in France, in Spain, in Germany, and he was a great scholar, great teacher. He was also offered at some point to become the Bishop of York, but he refused. He was very much influenced by St. Augustine, by Anselm of Aosta. I made a video about the latter, for example. So that if you go in the medieval Christianity playlist, you can see a progression even in the not maybe because they're not chronologically oriented, but if you search in the centuries playlist, you can see like a history of Christianity as was presented to you before. Like people change over the centuries. There was some different problems to address. And Bonaventura, again, is yet another of these people who were able to couple a Franciscan lifestyle with actually great involvement in politics, in practical matters, in the administration of the order, and actually satisfying a bit everyone. Like everybody was happy within the Franciscan order and the church of his work. There wasn't criticism. He did what he had to do. He was the man for the job, right? This is the moment, in fact, in which the friar minors are fully inserted within the learning and teaching. Because before this, the troubles that had produced themselves had actually created a lot of suspicion. Like, are these guys orthodox enough to do that effectively? Can we let them teach in the greatest universities? That's a quite important check, right? And think about our own times. We do not have much better systems of control, actually. As far as the Dominicans are concerned, like the friar preachers did not really need all these checks, because since the beginning, as we were saying, they had dedicated themselves to the doctrinal struggles, the theological disputes. They were pretty hawkish against the heretics, dialectically, rhetorically, logically. They knew how to kick ass, and in fact they did it magistrally, and they were all very, very well ordered, very well framed. So Franciscans and Dominicans, however, become pretty similar. Better, the Franciscans again are modeled within the church as an order after the Dominicans specifically, but they come from two different backgrounds, and they do maintain a bit their own respective bias. Except, of course, the university standards are the same. They become all great teachers, doctors, scientists, and they really rise to. So this is also incredible if you think about that. It's not just that they were brought there, but they actually achieved that quality standard. In fact, the Mendicants did not just found their own schools of theology, but because they already had them for teaching themselves, like when they were out of universities, but they in fact penetrated within the latter, right? This also, as we've seen with Paris, but that was not the only place, caused pretty strong reactions by the side of the secular teachers. We described, in fact, the most serious contrast in the 50s of the 13th century. This had a massive resonance. That's why the papacy was also pretty shattered by this. But it hadn't really involved anybody, so it would have been unavoidable. There were both the secular and lay Parisian professors, the papacy, the King of France, the students involved. And so the Parisian conflict was surely resolved, as we've seen, in favor of the Mendicants because they remained, right? And this thanks, of course, to the papal and royal support. At this point, as you know, the Pope and France, but since always, like since Clovis, even before Charlemagne, had always been incredibly strong. The Angevin, Guelph, Papal, French axis, in fact, was really exploding at this point, and again, in every single sector, theologically, scientifically, bureaucratically, statally, legally, like they were topping everything. They were controlling the most advanced areas in Europe, and we will have to come back on that specifically as well, because sometimes we miss, even when we talk about these theological struggles, the actual wealth at stake, or this, the enormity of the church possessions, and how this, of course, affected even all these, but also sometimes, like, positively, like they had the means to make things work smoothly. They had the best minds, they had the best means. So, of course, the Mendicants were not an option at this point. They had been inserted by the papacy in these contexts. It had been done even forcibly, but again, not because the standards were lower, right? One of the great advantages of the Mendicants had been the fact that they could check the secular clergy, meaning, bishops were more like princes within their own cities in many areas of Europe, and now sending the Mendicants differently from the monks properly, they would settle with communities within the cities, right, and not outside them. And so the preaching, teaching, assisting the people that would start, for example, leaving their drafting their testament in favor of them and becoming ever more closer, even the local priests or the local parishes, was a way for the papacy to control, in fact, those bishops who would not want to just to obey the papal monarchy as well. So it was actually the peak of papal power and control, thanks to this, because it worked, because it made sense, because it responded to the problems of the people that up to that point had been supporting the same paparistic evangelical movements, but without orthodoxy, or at least not necessarily with orthodoxy. Right now that these guys were in the papal hierarchy, they had a gold standard of orthodoxy, and they could offer the right answers to especially the bourgeoisie that was being born in more consistently in the cities, and these people having a lot of money and starting to have strange ideas, that including, it's just like the radical left today is just among the spoiled, sort of bored, atheistic, sort of disillusioned elites, not the traditional ones. It was a bit like the same at the time. These now Franciscans and Dominicans helped giving the actual answers, right? With the difference between today and yesterday, that yesterday people realized the necessity of God just for the life that they lived, and the much greater like concept connection with the reality compared to today's alienation from it, and a willing one especially. So the positivity of it does strike. In any case, the episode of Paris had also highlighted how these standards in fact could not be an option, right? Because the great scandal had occurred exactly because the Franciscans had screwed up. They had failed to control their most unruly fringes. They had allowed, even indirectly, this heresy to spread. Again, it's everybody's fault to different degrees, but that's the point. You if you want to support the high, I mean, if you want to, achieve the highest holiness, right? At least intentionally, you must have some standards that, yes, can be very unconventional, provocatives, and particularly, they have to be maybe in this sense revolutionary. This is one of the few cases in which you can use the term revolution, but not in the way we would otherwise intend. But you must still do this. In fact, it requires an enormous backbone, an enormous awareness. So you can't quite do it by, in fact, it's like rejecting the world and becoming lazy and thinking that you have to let essentially civilization die or tearing it down because you're not able to fight anymore for it. You want just to live a parasitic life asking for alms instead of building up an order with a hierarchy, with an education, with a greater understanding, a theoretical understanding, if anything, accompanying your own ascetic one, if you're so, of course, inclined to just pursue that lifestyle. So you understand it's not a clear cut, it's not just like a black and white issue. The black and white do exist at the extremes, but humanity, by definition, after the fall, falls always in between. With the only problem that it's much easier to fall towards the black than rise towards the white. And so the struggle here to remain afloat is already quite a big one per se. And you understand also the harsh means that were employed to convince the least, at least the most dangerous, let's put it in this way. We have, by the way, already by the time of the Parisian scandal, some of the most brilliant minds of the time teaching at university from the Mendicant orders. The greatest masters of Scholastic belonged to the new orders. We're talking names like Albertus Magnus, one of the greatest German philosophers, right, in history, particularly during the Middle Ages. We must make a video about him. We're talking, of course, about Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventura, the Bagnoregio that embody instead of course, the pre-humanistic Italian background. That this massive alliance among some of the most, say, Albertus Magnus, Albert from Swabia, Albert of Cologne, depending on how usually, like either from the place of teaching, the one of origin. No, we're talking some of the single most advanced areas in the world, as a matter of fact. They would produce these universally known profiles. I would be surprised to know how many people, of course, do not even know who these people are. Just their work, their stature, even just like the context would be enough. And of course, framed within this ecclesiastical policy and logic and historical dynamic. But there are actual people who vote, who have children, who drive cars without knowing who these people are. Just think about that when you get up in the morning, you go out in the morning, we live among them, right? And these people may even be the majority. And I think you cannot afford to be a Westerner, cannot afford to live in a civilized reality if you do not know who these people were, why they are important, and even more, you can't if you think that there is something wrong with of course, the general Catholic principle in the first place. And I defy you, at least if you follow me, you know what Catholic means, as you should, generally speaking, even without me, but many people literally don't understand. They think that there are some sort of fidgets, like meme-like boxes you have to check. I'm Protestant, or I'm Orthodox, or I'm Catholic. Do you know what Catholic actually means? And what I mean when I say what Catholic actually means, because I doubt that, unless you're not focused on that, because it literally means another thing from the one you think it does, right? It means that also, but it's, as always with this hierarchical values in civilization, what does that mean at a higher level beyond what you actually know? And it's not about the right necessarily or whatever. It's the actual principle in history. What do you know about Catholicism before Christianity, for example, in historical times? If you can't answer that question, it's a severe moral, cultural, and personal problem. And I promise that I'm going to make more videos to explain that. We mentioned before Bacon, right? The importance of the Minorite School of Oxford, especially for the development of a scientific mindset that, albeit of course accentuating the fideistic foundations of theology, was oriented towards the severely critical, say better, comprehension of the irrational principles of science and of metaphysics, the logical techniques, the physical inquiries, right? So this is the same environment from which William of Ockham would emerge from. Of course, he belongs to another phase, and mostly in a critical sense towards actually this system, where I made a video about him, and together with Marcellus of Padua, and in those contexts of decline of the papacy and of the same empire. But you see, especially Protestant historiography stresses the sort of, again, technical, empirical, in fact strongly scientific and material teaching of 16th century England, for example, towards more, I don't know, the nautical science, like interest, mathematics, right, things that would have allegedly, in part would, absolutely, like develop outside of the constraints of the Catholic, Inquisition, also the counter-reformistic policy and direction. But you can actually spot the seeds, of course, of the English. I mean, historically, this cannot be denied, of course, of English scientific thought and tradition in, of course, a Franciscan, potently Catholic and Catholically fueled scientific teaching from the very heart of Oxford. So just think about that, and how much the Middle Ages actually started something that just allowed the others to be on the shoulders of, just like these guys were on somebody else's shoulders. They were more aware of that, more thankful, more grateful for that matter. Yet the Mendicant accomplishments did not stop here, right? The Mendicants collected a broader challenge that at this point, as we've seen, was coming en masse, by the way, through the manuscript imports, translations, all something that, by the way, Europeans were doing autonomously, right? They weren't waiting for the authority or, the whichever, like the political or the ecclesiastical, but even the educational one, right? What is impressive, again, of the Westerners, it did not we're not passively exposed to the Greek, the Arab, the Jewish manuscripts. They literally went picking them because they knew where they were, what was contained in them, and they had already the linguistical skill to translate them. This is insane, right? It existed in some other parts of history in in absolute terms, but in relative terms, what happened here is never to be seen proportionally in history, right? Just the Middle Ages express in the medieval mindset the most inexhaustible thirst for knowledge, right? And what is interesting in the Mendicant theology, as Saint Bonaventure, by the way, expresses, is the need of God for this, right? You cannot have, there's a beautiful list, I should search for that, but you can say, you cannot have industry without charity, you cannot say every virtue you must own, just like you must be Platonic as much as Aristotelic. You must, in fact, according to the Catholic principle, cover the entirety of the world. You cannot just speculate scientifically without a moral basis. You cannot learn if you do not accept the principle of God in the first place. This is, say, the liberal criticism would sound just like today, like, you see, they wanted to impose you God before any other information, so they can twist it however they wanted. This has nothing to do with that. First of all, you have to understand what the concept of God is, which is, of course, is quite difficult for somebody who has already decided an absolute truth, like the non-existence of something that cannot even define and demonstrate in its opposite, like just because something is not demonstrated, must not exist, is not a scientific principle. The concept of God is the one of the truth, right? And so, of course, what Saint Bonaventure meant is not just, of course, having an adequate knowledge of the world, and together with theology, included theology, but especially that you cannot learn this without a form, and so an absolute standard that trains you to discern true from false, right from wrong, and never think that the two things are separated, right? If there is no scientific judgment, there is also no moral judgment, and vice versa, right? Something that is real because it's demonstrated, because it's brought up with evidence and solid logic and reason, is something that has a spiritual, a moral value as well, right? And it is not about moral absolutism, it is about the constant search and the constant widening of your vision so that you can accurately and objectively evaluate whatever you discover through the lenses of that knowledge, and that so the proportion that you can give to things in relation to one another, right? So God is unreachable in this sense because the truth is by our poor cognitive means, but it makes a hell of a difference going in the right direction and coming closer to it than simply pretending that any opinion is worth equally, even though it is not suffragated by reality itself, right? So the let's say the thirst of knowledge. You see, when you think what I was saying before, what knowledge was really in those times, and with all its limits to some extent, because again, knowledge is not necessarily about the materialistic determinism that we're habituated to think like. Essentially, when you think science, you think just about I will essentially learn how something mechanically functions, and if I can't, I will not enter in the realms of things like what is actually life or consciousness, or what should we do with that. And even though you cannot mechanically demonstrate that, it's still something you have to handle, and that's why we study history or politics or culture, because these are the things that really give dimension to the world, and it in an objective way, and the materialistic thing in itself does not, because it does not take into account agency. And so even if you do not believe in God, you cannot exclude mankind from the equation, which is incidentally what, in the Soviet Union they were doing, just by reducing everything to a materialism, thinking that the means of production, as they call them, were superior actually to humanity itself, that there were no things like genetically inherited traits, right? They literally sent people to gulags those scientists to gulags when they discovered that, because they associated, of course, the material dimension also with the spiritual one in the process. And we are actually discovering that this is the case if you look at say those epigenetical phenomena that really show us that behavior can alter the way the DNA is right. These are, you see, it's something that they knew. If you believe in transfiguration, basically you believe in the same thing, right? And so never think that you're actually a more intelligent person than somebody who lived in the 13th century, because most likely you're actually not, right? Let alone more capable or whatever, right? You're a worthless human being compared to that. And if you do not understand the reason, that's the proof of that. Because we know how this world was. We know from their principles what they were actually caring about. People who were capable of dominating. And this is not to say, well, say subjects like, for example, medicine, astronomy, astrology, you would say, but wait a second, mathematics of antiquity, or the same great Islamic or Hebraic cultures, as they were, of course, showing to the Christians from quite a while, and this was reciprocal, by the way. All this pushed to experiment, for example, alchemic practices, mechanical activities. Now, first of all, you would say, but these branches were sort of incomparable to ours because ours work better, and there's also sort of more complex. Never underestimate what these people were actually doing, right? Because the amount of knowledge they were actually, for example, just memorizing, and how this affected their mind and the capacity of analyzing and experimenting and just living their life and actualizing themselves is nowhere near to anything you can fathom. This is not about, again, what you can mechanistically or materialistically achieve. This is not about going to the moon, right? This is about getting somewhere spiritually that you have never been, with the sheer power of your mind. And you can understand it even just intellectually. If you do not want to accept this metaphysically, just realize that, when you know something more and better, you're enlightened. All of a sudden you say, oh my God, I'm glad I'm here mentally, as I wasn't there before. Again, what these guys did, you cannot come even close to. You're just mechanically repeating something that somebody else studied, that you would have not even had the inclination or the capacity to find out by yourself, and you're just repeating and applying in a very narrow and sort of controlled and unpressured way. These people were living in some of the toughest times in history in ways that you could not even mentally accept if you were projected then. And you must understand why they studied this, why it was thought that, of course, that there are deep intertwinements between a spiritual dimension that was considered as important as the material one, as we should. I mean, just the fact that we live, we exist, should make us see that, right? And this is not to say we shouldn't, we should be extremely grateful for all what we have, in fact, but we should, because we have the possibility of coupling this with the most important aspect, that is our moral dimension, which is actually the one that makes us truly being, right? Because a piece of matter does not. And this is the great mystery behind it all. How did this come about in the first place? We still don't know. And these people were asking that and finding, some answers that, telling the truth, are today discredited in pop culture after the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century because of anti-elite sentiments, anti-traditional, anti-quality sentiments. And actually, science is coming back again, saying, after the excess of materialism and determinism, well, you know what? It turns out that this is kind of like they had found out, right? And it's also kind of obvious, and we're also understanding that we have screwed up deeply in refusing this in the first place. And this is not to say that you should be practicing alchemy, or believing in astrology. But you should also understand, again, what their means were and what, again, they were practically achieving, which is, again, something that you can't quite see until you start focusing on the spiritual dimension as well. And this all went in parallel with astrology is astronomy at the same time. Again, alchemy is mechanics at the same time. And they were knowing other people's culture, that there was an anxiety of, again, a thirst for knowledge, but also a great capacity of, for example, of knowledge classification. I mean, the 13th century is just like, if you look at the manuscripts, they're enormous. The mirror of writing, the layout is all like high and tight, just like the Gothic architecture. It's all part of this projection towards the highest levels, the compression of information, of enormous quantities in information to make them readily accessible. Why do you think that Gothic script was formed like that, or why those manuscripts were now so huge? Because these were the ones used in universities in an ever more systematic, precise, accurate way. This is like found in great part of, often don't see this, but let's say what happened from the 14th to the 18th century was substantially based on what happened in the 13th, right? Even just in a quantitative sense, and or at least in the way the foundations of what we see as the Aristotelian-Ptolemaic system, but mostly what that had entailed civilizationally, had been founded there, right? And I have made multiple videos on tradition, on let's say also the value of the Renaissance, of the modern age, also the liberal revolutions later on. What did this mean overall in the history of mankind, right? They have a specifically spiritual, metaphysical meaning beyond the, again, little story that you had to learn by heart in school, just not, to get your parents angry about a bad mark, right? It's a completely different part of reality, in fact. This is important. The Mendicants were the protagonists in this, right? The Franciscans, the Dominicans, collected together with this a much broader, universal, eternal challenge, linking the philosophical reflection together with the philosophical, theological, juridical reflection. This was all one, right? You cannot think the universe if you don't think politics, if you do not think society, if you do not think war, how to regulate all this, right? They connected this also with the pastoral action, with preaching, right? People became more literate, right? Think about how many times you've been told that the church was obscurantistic, they didn't want others to know. Actually, the church at this point spread literacy. A big deal. Like, I made a video about this, especially it was about the 15th century. Of course, things went improving, but they mostly started from there. You would say, but it also created, again, a hierarchy that could not quite be challenged. Yes, but this also happened because in the 14th century, the crisis arrived, people went down overall. It was a massive crisis. Actually, the elites were heroic in holding everything together. Medieval civilization does not crumble like the ancient one. It actually evolves into the modern one. The Renaissance is essentially medieval, right? Medieval civilization arrives until 1792, 1919, depending on where you lived, right? Especially, it held on, and it also allowed eventually from that same war, from the improvement, the rising of the bourgeoisie, for example, that is sadly and ironically the same one that eventually tried to take down, at least to participate in ways that would dilute that sort of absolute order, because also the elites had sort of become weaker over time because of the general degeneration of the world by standards. So never be fooled by the perspective of this all. Never think that what the church was doing at this point was rowing backwards. They weren't, as a matter of fact. And also later on, they were rowing backwards, but compared to certain ideologies that also caused some of the most disastrous, ruinous genocides, destructions, and holocausts in the history of mankind, you cannot quite unsee that, right? And this is what was not actually happening at this point. It is true that they lacked the coercive means. It's true that, let's say, in fact, it's not accidental that the world took the time to evolve and to degenerate in part, but also to improve in others in the process, and that each era has its own things. But it's also undeniable that the 13th century was the peak of the great medieval civilization that up to this point has never died. What we were at the time in Europe were pretty much the same today, and under so many aspects. It was true for also much more ancient times. It doesn't matter how also many things change at the top. There are some roots as well that are consolidated further and very deeply by these phenomena. So, and also at a mass level. So to help actually people, not to oppress them. So this is very controversial, and of course, again, on a channel like this, we haven't started even a manualistic series on basic modern history, so not just modern warfare, as I fortunately and satisfactorily venture into, and with some degree of depth, but without, in fact, the broader background. These are things I hope to explain at some point, because I think we can't go on without, right? This channel is aimed at making people aware of how much has been hidden to you out of incompetence, lack of purpose, sort of general evil as well. This is not a matter of mere, say, ignorance. It's not disjuncted from evil, as a matter of fact. It's something we must recover a bit more strictly. And at the same time, we should think that this is also a way just to grow ourselves. Like, we can't see this, I think, in any other way. Like, once you acknowledge this, you're open with a world that is not a farce. It's literally what you can see through, like, if you have any, you see, these ideas are not just, let's say, I'm criticizing widely and I'm of course explaining things, I'm making disclosure, but but the accomplishments of 13th century history, of scholastics, of all these authors, of the Dominicans, the Franciscans, are massively studied. Like, it's like if you actually enter a library, if you even just buy a book on Amazon, right? You can easily access that world. It just takes a book to have hundreds of others in the bibliography to search for. And the only truth is that nobody does today, because we're just a bunch of disgusting ignorance, especially compared to those times. And you're responsible for that. I mean, the world is worse because of this, actively, and also because we waste an enormous amount of time doing things that in fact have no purpose, that are devoid of form, with very low substance as well, and therefore make life more worthless. These people, of course, distinguished actively between power and say, potential and action, because that's what life is, right? You have only one. You have only one shot, and actually the way this is lost is through your own shortcoming during your same life. So killing yourself at the end of the day, making yourself mortal. This is what the original sin is actually about at the end of the day. And the let's say the enormous question, even as we were saying before, the reasons behind asceticism, behind hermitage, behind all these deprivations, but also this enormous work, for example, at the university level, at a civilizational level, politically, legally, and more scientifically as well, are the proof that power does exist in the world, and that it is enacted, it's enactable and enacted, and we have these examples, and we're at this point in history, we're essentially not even deciding, just by our lifestyle, we should not even thinking about them. The average person would never think to make a video like this, because what's the point? All right. Of course, if you do not know what happened, you cannot know what's the point, and so that's the actual problem. And this is what the 13th century person was already more intelligent than you for. And again, even if it doesn't take much, to be more intelligent than you. And that's something that should wake you up a little bit, right? And we all learned that in the same way, with the same degree of frustration and pain, and but it passes mostly from also accepting our own responsibility and fixing ourselves in the way I think we really deserve, because that's the spirit we should really have, but doing it by ourselves. All right. So we will surely make other videos about this. What day is today? Because I record this, I took the habit of recording this, yes, a day in advance. So this goes for Easter, by the way. So I didn't tell you Happy Easter before, but actually have a little surprise for you that will, okay, when is it? It's tomorrow. Yeah, okay, no, this is not for Easter, actually. Easter is the day after, sorry. But most of you will actually see this in Easter anyway. I will make another video on Easter, a more violent one, but I also will make a little one as well for Easter as well. So that will be my my wish for you. For today, however, we stop it here. We'll surely keep talking about Christian history. I think I have something here in store already. This was, sure, I remember this video I had to do with, we have, okay, the Studia Franciscans, Dominicans, here we are. This one, the next history of Christianity, well, it's not that close, objectively. Actually, there isn't. Yeah, I thought there was another one coming soon, but it's not the case. In any case, I may be wrong. We have lots of stuff incoming. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.